Hook. The entire gym stopped breathing the moment she walked in wearing scrubs. She was 32 years old, 5'6", and she smelled like antiseptic in a 12-hour shift. The black belt standing at the center of the mat looked at her, the way men like him always looked at women like her, like she was furniture that had wandered into the wrong room. He laughed first. His students laughed second. That was the order of things in his gym. What none of them knew, what he didn't know, was that the quiet nurse gripping a beginner's enrollment form had once kept 3 soldiers alive in a collapsed building with nothing but field dressings and her bare hands. By the end of that night, he would know exactly who she was. If this story already has you hooked, stay with me until the very last second. And while you're here, hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Part 1. The shift had run 14 hours. That was not unusual for Nora Voss. What was unusual was the way her hands had stopped shaking somewhere around hour 11, which meant the adrenaline was gone and the exhaustion had taken over completely, and she had learned long ago that exhaustion was actually more dangerous than panic, because at least panic kept you sharp. She had intubated a man who coded twice in the trauma bay. She had held the hand of a 17-year-old girl whose parents didn't arrive until after it was too late. She had argued with the attending physician named Dr. Harlan Briggs over a medication dosage, and she had been right, and he had made her feel like a student for being right, and she had absorbed it the same way she absorbed most things at Caldwell Regional Medical Center, quietly, carefully, without letting it show on her face. The hospital sat in the middle of Denton Falls, a mid-sized city in the kind of state where winters arrived without warning and stayed too long. Denton Falls was not glamorous. It had a good university, a decent minor league baseball team, 3 diners that had been open since before most of the staff at Caldwell Regional were born, and a crime rate that climbed every year while the city budget for social services went the opposite direction. Nora had been working the emergency department for 4 years. Before that, she had been somewhere else entirely, doing something she didn't talk about at work. She changed out of her scrubs in the locker room, pulled on a pair of running tights and a worn gray sweatshirt, and sat on the bench with her sneakers in her hands for a moment longer than she needed to. The fluorescent light above her flickered once. The locker room smelled like floor cleaner and old coffee, and the particular kind of tired that seeps into walls when a building runs on human endurance 24 hours a day. She had told herself she would go home. She had told herself that 3 times this week, and 3 times she had ended up at the same address on Maplecroft Street instead, because going home to a quiet apartment after a shift like that did something to her she couldn't quite name. It left too much room for the thoughts to move around, and she had learned that movement helped. The flyer had appeared on the hospital's community board 6 weeks ago. She had walked past it a dozen times before she finally pulled out her phone and photographed it. Iron Crest Martial Arts, Adult Beginner and Intermediate Classes. All fitness levels welcome. Instructors certified in BJJ, Krav Maga, and police defensive tactics. She had not enrolled for sport. She had enrolled because she understood, in a practical way that most people didn't, that the world was not as safe as it appeared, and that the specific skills she had once carried had gone somewhat dormant over 4 years of civilian life, and that dormant skills were liabilities. That was how she thought about it. She was not sentimental about it. She just wanted to stay functional. Iron Crest Martial Arts occupied the ground floor of a converted warehouse on Maplecroft Street, wedged between a tire shop and a Filipino restaurant that smelled extraordinary at all hours. The front windows were floor to ceiling, which meant anyone walking past could see the mats, the heavy bags along the far wall, the framed competition photographs, and the man who stood at the center of it all like he had been placed there specifically for visibility. Officer Dale Vickers was 38 years old, 6'1", and built with the specific density of someone who had trained hard for 15 years and made sure everyone around him was aware of it. He had a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, a law enforcement background he referenced constantly, and a voice that was calibrated to carry across a room without effort. He was in the middle of running a technique demonstration when Nora pushed through the front door. She stood near the entrance for a moment, enrollment form in hand, taking in the layout without appearing to. It was an old habit. She didn't think about it consciously. She just did it, the way some people instinctively check for exits in restaurants or glance both directions on a one-way street. 12 students on the mat, 3 watching from the side. Equipment storage along the left wall, improperly organized. Someone had stacked resistance bands over the foam rollers, which would cause a slide if anyone reached for them quickly. The rear exit was propped open 3 inches with a rubber wedge, which was either a ventilation choice or sloppiness. And from the temperature inside the gym, she guessed sloppiness. The man in the center of the mat, Vickers, was demonstrating a wrist control technique on a student who was maybe 20 years old and visibly uncomfortable with how tightly the grip was being applied. Not practice uncomfortable, actually uncomfortable. Nora walked toward the front desk, where a young woman with a tablet and a gym polo shirt looked up with the automatic smile of someone trained to deploy it on entry. "Hi, welcome to Ironcrest. Are you here for the 7 o'clock class?" "I'm here to enroll," Nora said. "I called ahead, Nora Voss." "Oh yes, you're the one who asked about the adult beginner site. Great, let me pull that up." The young woman typed something. "Have you done any martial arts before?" "Not formally." That was technically accurate. "Okay, so you'd be starting in the fundamentals track. Officer Vickers runs Tuesday and Thursday evenings, and we also have what happened to that kid's wrist?" The young woman looked up from the tablet. On the mat, the demonstration had concluded, and the 20-year-old student was rotating his wrist with an expression that was trying very hard to be composed. He sat back down on the mat with the slightly stiff posture of someone absorbing pain they didn't want to name. "Oh, that's just... Officer Vickers applies realistic pressure during demos. It's part of the methodology." "Realistic pressure," Nora repeated. "Yes." The young woman's smile was back, but it was working harder now. "He believes students need to understand what actual resistance feels like, so I'll fill this out," Nora said, and took the enrollment form. She sat on the bench along the wall and wrote her information in the clean, compressed handwriting of someone who had spent years riding in moving vehicles in low light. She could hear Vickers from across the room. His voice ran at a frequency designed to be heard by everyone, whether they were the intended audience or not. The problem with civilian training is that civilians want to feel like they're learning something without actually being challenged. You want to be challenged. You come here. You want to feel good about yourself. You go somewhere else. This is not a feel-good gym. A few of the students nodded. The ones who had been there longest nodded fastest, which told Nora something about the environment that the front desk girl's carefully managed smile had not. She finished the form and brought it back. "The 7 o'clock is actually just starting," the young woman said. "If you want, you can observe tonight and officially begin Thursday." "I'll observe tonight," Nora said. She changed into her training clothes in the locker room, the same tights and sweatshirt, because she hadn't thought to bring anything else, and came out just as Vickers was wrapping up the demonstration portion and moving the class into warm-up drills. He noticed her immediately. That was obvious not because he looked at her for a long time, but because he looked at her for exactly the right length of time to communicate that he had assessed her and categorized her without breaking the rhythm of what he was saying to the group. She found a space at the edge of the mat and began stretching. "You the one observing?" He walked toward her while the class continued their warm-up behind him, which meant he trusted them to keep going without supervision, which meant he had conditioned them well enough that they would, and that told her something about his actual competence beneath the performance of it. "Nora Voss," she said. "I enrolled at the front. What's your background? Any experience?" "I'm a nurse." His face did the thing. It was subtle, barely a shift in the muscles around his eyes, but she had learned to read it over years of reading people in high-stress situations, and what it said was, category confirmed, expectation set, conversation already finished. "Okay, Nora the nurse." He said it without cruelty, which was somehow worse than cruelty because it was dismissiveness dressed up as casual. "Tonight you observe, you don't touch anything, and you ask questions at the end if you have them. Clear?" "Clear," she said. He walked back to the class. She watched. I was technically good. She acknowledged that without attachment to it. His jujitsu mechanics were clean. The hip placement was correct, the weight distribution was consistent, and he understood how to use leverage rather than raw strength, which was the actual point of the discipline. His instruction was organized. He moved through progressions logically, but there was a layer underneath the instruction that she kept returning to. It was the way he chose his demonstration partners. He didn't rotate evenly through the class. He selected, consistently, from the smaller students and the newer ones. A woman in her mid-40s who was visibly trying very hard. A thin college-age kid who tensed every time Vickers approached. The same 20-year-old whose wrist she had noticed at the door. He applied technique with more force than demonstration required. Not enough to cause obvious injury, exactly enough to make the point that he could. 40 minutes in, Vickers called the class into a circle for a sparring demonstration. "I need a volunteer," he said. "Someone who thinks they've been paying attention." Nobody moved immediately. That was a tell. In a healthy training environment, you'd have 3 hands up before the sentence finished. The hesitation lasted almost 4 seconds before the thin college-age kid, his name was Marcus, she had picked that up from the warm-up drills, slowly raised his hand. "Marcus, come on." Marcus stepped into the center of the circle. He was maybe 22, lean, with the deliberate posture of someone who had decided that good posture was the thing he could control in situations where control felt scarce. Vickers circled him once. Not functionally, theatrically, for the benefit of the group. "Okay, Marcus, show me what you've got. Full resistance. I want everyone watching to understand what it looks like to actually apply pressure instead of just practicing in the mirror." Marcus came in with a takedown attempt that was technically reasonable for someone at his level. Vickers countered it, and the counter was correct, but then he didn't stop at the counter. He continued through into a ground control position that locked Marcus's shoulder at an angle that produced an audible sound. Not a pop, just the high complaint of a joint being pushed toward its limit. Marcus made a sound that was halfway between a controlled exhale and something else. Vickers held the position for 3 seconds longer than any legitimate demonstration required. Then he released it and stood up and turned to the class. "That's what real resistance feels like. That's what I'm talking about. When someone actually, his shoulder needs to be checked." The room shifted. Not dramatically, more like a pressure change, the kind you feel before a storm, when the air does something specific that your nervous system registers before your brain catches up. Vickers turned. Nora was standing at the edge of the circle. "You're observing," he said. His voice had not changed volume. That was intentional. His shoulder is in the wrong position, and he's guarding it. If you keep running the class without checking it, and he re-injures it trying to compensate, that's a liability for your facility. I'm a nurse. I'm telling you to check his shoulder." Vickers stared at her. The class was completely silent. Marcus was sitting on the mat with his right arm held at a specific angle, the arm slightly away from his body, the elbow bent at 45 degrees, which was the involuntary positioning of a shoulder that was protecting itself from further insult. Nora had seen it in trauma bays. She had seen it in places Marcus would not have believed she'd been. "He's fine," Vickers said. "He's not fine." She stepped forward into the circle. Not aggressively, just into the space where the conversation was happening. "Marcus, can you raise your arm to shoulder height?" Marcus looked at Vickers. Then he looked at Nora. Then he tried to raise his arm, and it stopped about 30 degrees short of shoulder height, and the effort produced a sharp compression in his expression that he could not fully control. "Yeah," Nora said quietly. "Okay." She looked up at Vickers. "He needs ice and an evaluation. He should not continue class tonight." Vickers let the silence run for a moment. It was a deliberate technique. She recognized it as such. The silence was meant to communicate that he was deciding how to respond, which implied that her input was something he was considering granting rather than something that had standing on its own merit. "Who are you again?" "Nora Voss. I enrolled tonight. I'm also telling you that student has a potential rotator cuff involvement and needs to stop. You've been here 40 minutes. You don't have rank. You don't have mat time, and you don't have authority in this gym." He said it evenly, which was more effective than saying it with heat. "So what I'd suggest is that you go back to the wall, keep watching, and let the people with actual training experience run the class." The woman in her mid-40s, Nora had heard someone call her Diane, was looking at the floor. Marcus was still sitting with his arm at that angle. "I'm not trying to run your class," Nora said. "I'm trying to make sure your student gets ice on a shoulder that's showing impingement signs." "I've trained for 15 years, Vickers said. I've trained police officers, competitive fighters, and military personnel. A nurse who walked in off the street 40 minutes ago does not tell me how to run my gym." He turned back to the class. "Everyone partner up. We're moving to guard passing." She got Marcus ice from the front desk cooler while the class moved on. He took it with the particular gratitude of someone who wasn't used to being looked after without it costing something, and he held it against his shoulder under his shirt because he didn't want Vickers to notice. "Does it do that often?" she asked, keeping her voice low. Marcus shrugged, his left shoulder. "He gets intense sometimes." "Has anyone said anything to him about it?" "Danny did, like 2 months ago. He's not here anymore." She let that sit. "Are you going to come back?" Marcus asked. He was genuinely curious, not sarcastic. "I paid for a month," she said. She returned to the wall. She watched the rest of the class with the same steady attention she brought to monitoring a trauma bay. Not looking for anything specific, just keeping the whole picture in focus and letting the details surface on their own. What she saw over the next 40 minutes. Vickers corrected a woman's technique by physically adjusting her without asking permission first. He responded to a question from an older student with a patience so visibly manufactured, it was almost impressive. He looked at Nora 3 times, each look exactly calibrated to communicate that she was being tolerated rather than welcomed. After class, as students gathered their gear and trickled toward the exit, he crossed to where she was putting her shoes back on. "Word of advice," he said. "This gym has a culture. The culture works because people respect the hierarchy. You've been doing emergency medicine long enough, you get it. There's a chain of command. You don't walk in on day 1 and try to rewrite how things run." "I didn't try to rewrite anything," she said. "I told you a student was injured." "He was fine." She looked at him. His shoulder was in protective abduction. You held a joint lock 3 seconds past the appropriate demonstration limit. He's going to wake up tomorrow, and it's going to be worse than it felt tonight. And when it is, I want you to think about that specific moment and ask yourself if the 3 seconds were worth it. Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger. Something more calculated than anger. "You're welcome to request a refund," he said. "I'm not requesting a refund," she said. I'm coming back Thursday." She picked up her bag and walked out. Thursday, she arrived at 6:45. She had spent the intervening 2 days working a day shift at Caldwell Regional, managing 3 sepsis cases, a pediatric allergic reaction, and a 40-minute standoff with an insurance pre-authorization system over a medication that a patient needed immediately and the system needed 17 business days to approve. Normal things. The kind of things that required a specific type of sustained, grinding focus that she had found over years she was built for. She had also texted Marcus. She had gotten his number from the sign-in sheet. Not covertly, she had just asked the front desk girl, who had paused for approximately 1 second before giving it to her, which meant the front desk girl was exercising her own private judgment about the situation. "How's the shoulder?" "Pretty sore." "Iced it like you said." "Not going Thursday, probably." "That's smart. If it's not better in a week, get imaging done." "Thanks." "You're actually going back?" "Yes." "Be careful. He doesn't like being challenged." She had looked at that last message for a moment before setting her phone down. She was aware, in a way that was more physical than conceptual, that what she was doing had a shape to it that she recognized. The particular geometry of a situation where someone with power had established that power through intimidation, and where the appropriate response was not escalation, but also not retreat. She had been in those situations before. The contexts had been different. The geometry was the same. Thursday's class had 8 students. 2 of them were new. A man in his 40s named Greg, who had the build of someone who had played college sports and was now rediscovering his body, and a young woman named Petra, who moved with the careful watchfulness of someone in an unfamiliar environment. Vickers acknowledged Nora's presence with nothing more than a glance when she came through the door. She changed, warmed up independently, and took her position at the edge of the mat. The first 40 minutes were technique instruction, guard passing sequences, a standing-to-ground transition, a basic escapes from mount. Nora watched, repeated the movements in small controlled form beside the mat when the class was working in pairs, and let her body remember things she hadn't asked it to remember in a while. The movements were familiar. The mechanics were similar to things she had been taught in different settings, by people who had not called it martial arts, but whose underlying logic had been identical. Control, leverage, economy of motion, using a situation's own energy rather than fighting it directly. The trouble started at the 45-minute mark. Vickers was running a defense sequence, demonstrating a choke defense on Greg, who was large enough that the demonstration had natural visual weight. He ran through it twice, the technique was correct, and then he opened the floor. Questions on the mechanics? Petra raised her hand. She was careful about it. The hand came up slowly, like she had calculated the social risk of the gesture. Why does the elbow need to go that direction specifically? I tried it and it felt like, because that's how it's done, Vickers said. He said it pleasantly. That was the thing that made it function the way it functioned. It was delivered as a statement of fact rather than as a dismissal, which meant the dismissal was invisible to anyone who wasn't paying attention to the thing underneath the words. Petra lowered her hand. Actually, Nora said, the elbow angle is creating a moment arm against the choke pressure. If you point it inward, you're increasing your mechanical advantage. There's a reason for it, and knowing the reason helps you execute it under stress. Vickers looked at her. The class looked at her. I don't think I asked for commentary, Vickers said. She asked why, Nora said. I answered. The temperature in the room was a specific kind of charged, not hostile yet, more like static, the air before lightning rather than the lightning itself. You have no rank here, Vickers said. You don't answer questions in my class. I have a medical degree and 12 years of applied biomechanics, Nora said, which wasn't exactly accurate. She had an emergency nursing certification and 12 years of things she wasn't elaborating on in this gym, but the underlying point was sound. When a student asks a legitimate question about body mechanics, the answer matters. 12 years of applied biomechanics. He repeated it back with a quality in his voice that was meant to be droll, to perform skepticism for the room. You know what? Fine. Let's talk about body mechanics. Come here. She stepped onto the mat. Show me the defense, he said, since you understand it so well. She understood what this was. It was not an invitation to demonstrate technique. It was an invitation to be embarrassed by someone who outweighed her, outranked her in this specific room, and had every structural advantage available to him. She stood across from him, and they set their positions, Vickers' hand at her collar, her hand on his wrist. She ran the defense. It was not elaborate. She didn't try to make it look like anything other than what it was. Elbow in, rotation, weight shift, release. The sequence was about 2 seconds, and at the end of it, Vickers' collar grip was broken, and she was in a neutral position with her hands free. The room was quiet, in the specific way rooms get quiet when something has happened that the available vocabulary can't quite process. Vickers reset. Again. She ran it again, the same 2 seconds, the same result. He reset a third time, and this time he didn't telegraph what he was doing, he just applied the choke with real pressure, not demonstration pressure, actual pressure, the way you'd apply it to someone you were genuinely trying to stop. She felt it and moved before the pressure fully built, which was the point of the technique, which was the answer to Petra's question, which was why knowing the reason for the elbow angle actually mattered. The release was cleaner the third time because she wasn't thinking about it. Vickers stepped back. Beginner's luck, he said. But the words had lost whatever weight he'd meant them to carry, and he seemed to feel that because he turned back to the class with a deliberateness that was just slightly too sharp. Partner up, same sequence. Voss, you're with Petra. She worked with Petra for the rest of the session. Petra was a quick learner. She had good spatial awareness, and she asked precise questions, the kind that came from someone who thought carefully before opening their mouth. Where did you actually learn this? Petra asked, quietly, while they rotated through the exercise. Different places, Nora said. Different places like different places. She offered Petra a small, direct look that communicated she was not being evasive for dramatic reasons, simply for factual ones. Petra accepted this with a nod that said she was filing it away. After class, Vickers did not approach her. He talked to several other students near the equipment rack, and he was loud about it, louder than he needed to be, the way people get when they're performing normalcy because something has disturbed their actual equilibrium. She was not central to the performance, but she was the reason for it. She packed her bag and she was almost to the door when one of the senior students, a man named Carver, who had a blue belt and the bearing of someone who had been in the gym long enough to identify with the institution, fell into step beside her. You should know, Carver said, low and without preamble, that Vickers doesn't forget things. I'm not sure what I did that he'd need to remember, she said. You made him look regular in front of his class. Carver said it neutrally, like he was conveying information rather than passing judgment. He's been the singular thing in this gym for 5 years. People have left because of it. Some of them left because they didn't want to, if you understand me. Danny, she said. Carver's expression shifted a small increment. Yeah, among others. He stopped at the door. I'm not saying don't come back. I'm saying come back with your eyes open. I always do, she said. She walked out into the parking lot. The night air was cold enough to sting. The tire shop next door had closed, and the Filipino restaurant was in full evening service, and the smell of garlic and vinegar and something deep-fried drifted across the asphalt in a way that made her aware she hadn't eaten since 2 in the afternoon. She sat in her car for a moment. Her hands were steady. They were almost always steady now. That had taken years, and she was not going to make it sentimental. But she noted it the way she noted most things, as data. She put the car in reverse and thought about Marcus's shoulder and Petra's careful questions and the specific geometry of a situation that was not finished. She had 2 more weeks of paid enrollment. She was going to use all of them. The call came at 4 in the morning on a Tuesday. It was from Caldwell Regional, which was not unusual. She was listed as a secondary contact for high-volume shifts, and Denton Falls had the particular quality of a city where Tuesdays at 4 in the morning occasionally required more hands than were scheduled. She was awake before the second ring, which was also not unusual. Voss. The voice on the other end was Dr. Ansel Rowe, the night attending, who had the quality of someone who had been working emergency medicine long enough that he called people by their last names automatically and had stopped noticing it. Mass casualty coming in, vehicle collision on the Denton bypass, charter bus and 2 semis. We have confirmed 12 critical, more incoming. I need you here. She was dressed and out the door in 4 minutes. The emergency department at Caldwell Regional became, over the next 6 hours, the kind of place that exists outside normal time. 12 critical became 17, 3 patients coded, 2 of those survived. The organized chaos of a trauma bay at capacity had its own internal logic. People moved between roles in a way that looked improvisational from outside, and was actually the result of thousands of hours of training, the muscles remembering what the mind was too occupied to consciously direct. Nora worked a man through hemorrhagic shock for 40 minutes. She intubated a woman whose airway was compromised by soft tissue swelling from impact. She made 3 judgment calls that fell outside her nursing scope, and made them anyway, because Dr. Rowe was occupied with a chest decompression in the bay next to her, and the alternative to making the calls was watching someone decline. Dr. Harlan Briggs appeared at 6 in the morning as the surge was beginning to taper, and surveyed the department with the proprietary air of a man arriving at something he considered his, even when he had not been present for the difficult part. "Who authorized the ketamine dose in Bay 4?" he said, looking at the chart. "I did," Nora said. She was stripping gloves, her 3rd pair of the morning. "You're a nurse." Dr. Rowe was unavailable. The patient's pain management was escalating toward cardiovascular event. I made a judgment call. Briggs looked at her over the rims of his glasses. He had a way of doing this. The slightly lowered chin, the glasses acting as a prop for the expression, that communicated a hierarchy he had never had to construct because he had simply been born into a world that handed it to him. "We'll discuss the protocol issue in my office," he said. "Yes," she said. "We will." She meant something different by it than he did, but she didn't clarify. She finished the shift at 8, sat in the parking garage for 10 minutes, eating a protein bar that tasted like chalk and achievement, and drove home. She slept for 4 hours. She went back to Ironcrest at 7. The gym was different that Tuesday. Not the physical space. The mats were the same, the heavy bags were the same, the framed photographs of Vickers' competition wins lined the same wall. But there were more people. 14 students instead of the usual 8 or 10, which meant word had gotten around about something. She found out at the start of class. "Tonight," Vickers said, addressing the room with the specific energy of a man who had prepared what he was going to say, "we're doing a different kind of session. Some of you have been asking about practical application, what this training actually looks like when it's not choreographed. We're going to run some free sparring, no formal rules, controlled contact, but real resistance. I want everyone to understand what that feels like." He looked at Nora when he said real resistance. It was not subtle. She held his gaze for 2 seconds and then looked at the mat. The session began with technical work, and then, progressively, it was clear that Vickers was building toward something. He ran the students through increasingly intense drills. He pushed the contact levels up. He was calibrating the room. elevating everyone's nervous system, creating a context where the escalation he intended would feel natural rather than manufactured. She recognized the technique. She had seen it applied in other contexts by people with different uniforms and different purposes, and the recognition was cold and clarifying. At the 40-minute mark, he called a break, and then stood in the center of the mat. "I want to do a demonstration," he said. "Real speed, real resistance application. I need someone who thinks they understand defensive mechanics." He looked directly at Nora. "Voss, you've been pretty vocal about technique. Let's see it in context." The room waited. She set down her water bottle. "What are the parameters?" she said. "Full contact, controlled but realistic. If you tap, we stop. Standard safety." She walked onto the mat. She was aware, in the way that she was aware of most things, with a clarity that came from having operated in environments where awareness was the margin between functional and not. That this was not a skills demonstration. This was a public recalibration. He intended to put her on the ground, in front of the group, in a way that would restore the social architecture she had been disrupting by existing in his space with the skill set she had. She also knew something he did not. She knew that she had spent 4 years allowing most of what she had learned to rest beneath the surface, because the surface was where she lived now, and the life she had built on it was good and worth protecting. She knew that rest was not the same as gone. They squared off. He came forward with the controlled aggression of someone who expected to be significantly faster than his opponent, and in the first exchange she let him establish that expectation. She moved defensively, she absorbed a grip, she disengaged, she gave him the first 2 seconds of the narrative he was writing. Then he went for a takedown. She didn't sprawl. She redirected, turning the momentum 90 degrees rather than fighting it, and in the instant of his recovery she was in a position that gave her 4 options, any of which would have ended the exchange immediately. She chose none of them. She stepped back to neutral. He stopped. His breathing had changed, not dramatically, but enough that she noticed. The class was very quiet. "Again," he said. She waited for him. He came harder the second time, committing more fully, and she felt the difference in the speed and the angle and the specific quality of intent behind it. He was not demonstrating anymore. He had moved past that into something more direct, and the room around them had registered the shift without being able to name it. She let him close the distance, and in the last moment before contact she moved, inside his reach, offline from his center line, controlling his lead arm at the elbow. And then she stopped. They were close enough that she could hear him breathing. "This," she said, to the room, but also to him, "is where the elbow angle matters. Petra, this is the answer to your question." She stepped back. Vickers stood in the center of the mat with something crossing his face that she was careful not to name too quickly, because she had learned that men like him could move from embarrassment to commitment very quickly, and commitment was where things became actually dangerous. "You think you're teaching my class," he said. Low. Just for her. "I think I'm answering a question that was asked 2 days ago," she said. "Let me be clear," he said, and his voice had shifted. Still controlled, but carrying something underneath the control now. "You are a guest in this gym. You don't have rank. You don't have history here. And if you can't respect the structure of how this place works, then what?" she said. The silence that followed that question had a different quality than the previous silences. This one was the kind that comes before a decision, when the world is pausing to see what the next action will be. Vickers looked at her for a long moment. Around them, the class was perfectly still. "Then you're done here," he said. "You want to keep training, you train by my rules. You undermine me in my gym one more time, you hand in your key fob, and you don't come back." She looked at him. "Okay," she said. She walked off the mat and picked up her water bottle. Greg, the man in his 40s, who had been present for all of this with the expression of someone trying to figure out if the situation was as strange as it felt, caught her eye from across the room. He gave her a small, slow nod that she accepted without inflection. She was almost to the door when her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. It was a number she had not seen in 4 years, and the name above it was not a name she had expected to see in this parking lot, in this city, in this version of her life. 3 words in the text. "We need you." She stared at those 3 words for a moment that stretched longer than it should have, standing in the doorway of Iron Crest with the cold air pushing in around her and the noise of the gym at her back. The number had a Virginia area code. She hadn't needed to see the name to know that. She had memorized that number the same way she had memorized a lot of things during a period of her life she had since filed away under prior. Not forgotten, just stored somewhere that didn't require daily access. The name above the number was Sergeant Dominic Farrell. She walked to her car. She sat down. She closed the door and held the phone in both hands and thought about the text for 30 seconds without responding to it, which was not hesitation. It was information gathering. Because we need you from Dominic Farrell at 9:43 on a Tuesday night meant something specific, and the something specific was not going to be small. She typed back, talk or text. The response came in under 10 seconds. Call. Give me 2 minutes. She turned the heat on. Outside, a couple walked past on the sidewalk, close together against the cold, arguing about something in the comfortable way of people who have been arguing about the same things for years and have made peace with the fact that they will continue to. The Filipino restaurant's neon sign threw red and yellow light across the hood of her car. Her phone rang at exactly the 2-minute mark. That was Dominic. Voss, he said. Farrell. She kept her voice flat, not cold, just level. The register she used when she needed information before she decided what to do with it. It's been 4 years. I know. He paused, and in the pause she could hear the background of wherever he was, not an office, too much ambient noise, somewhere outside. I wouldn't call if it wasn't necessary. I know that too. What is it? Another pause, shorter. You remember Linden Base? Linden Base. Linden Base was a forward operating support installation located in a geography she was not going to name out loud, where she had spent 18 months doing work that was officially classified as medical support and operationally classified as something considerably more complicated. Linden Base was where she had met Dominic, where she had met the 6 other people who constituted what their unit had called a team only in the most functional sense of the word. Not bonded by sentiment, bonded by proximity and shared operational pressure, and the specific kind of trust that comes from surviving things together that you can't fully describe to anyone who wasn't there. Yes, she said. We had a situation, Dominic said. 14 days ago, one of ours. You know her, Nora Voss. Nora was quiet for a beat. Nora Voss was 29 years old, originally from outside Savannah, with the kind of precise intelligence that had made her genuinely dangerous in fieldwork, and the kind of dry, flat humor that it had made her bearable to sit next to on a 14-hour transport. She had served as the unit's signals and surveillance specialist. The last time Nora had seen her was at a debrief at a location she was not going to name, 3 weeks before Nora had signed her separation papers and walked out of that world. What kind of situation? She's here, in Denton Falls. Nora went still. Why is she in Denton Falls? Because she followed something here, something that started at Linden. Records that went somewhere they weren't supposed to go, procurement data, medical supply chain, big numbers. She's been working it for 8 months, off the books, because she didn't trust the chain of command to handle it without it disappearing. Why didn't she trust the chain of command? Because 2 of the people in the chain of command are in the numbers. The heat in the car was finally working. Outside, the couple had moved on. The sidewalk was empty. What does she need? Nora said. She needs someone local who understands what she's carrying, someone she trusts. She's in a bad position, Voss. She's been running this alone too long and she's starting to show the edges. She found a contact in Denton Falls who might be able to bridge the data to federal oversight, but the contact needs verification, someone with standing. I'm a nurse, Nora said. I don't have standing in anything she's working. You have standing with Yara. That's what she needs right now. He paused again. And you have the kind of standing that doesn't come from a job title. You know that. She did know that. She also knew that she had spent 4 years building a life that was deliberately not this, and that the 3 words on her phone screen had just put a crack in the wall between the 2 versions of herself that she had been maintaining with considerable effort. Where is she? Nora said. Nora Voss was staying in a motel on the east side of Denton Falls called the Sunrise Inn, which was a name that implied considerably more optimism than the building's current condition supported. It sat at the junction of 2 state routes, surrounded by a gas station, a closed laundromat, and a chain restaurant that had been converted into a tax preparation office, the kind of place where people stayed when they were between things. Nora knocked on room 11 at 11:15 that night. She had driven past the motel twice before parking, not because she expected to be followed, but because old habits had their own momentum, and she had stopped fighting them. The door opened after a long pause, the pause of someone checking through the peephole and making a decision. And then Yara Moss was standing in the doorway. She was thinner than the last time Nora had seen her, not alarmingly, but noticeably. The specific thinning of someone who had been running on a combination of purpose and insufficient sleep for too long. She was wearing a gray thermal shirt and jeans and no shoes, and she held the door with one hand and kept the other slightly out of view, which was a positioning Nora recognized. "Voss?" Yara said. "Moss," Nora said. Yara looked at her for 2 seconds with the flat, assessing look that had been her default expression in every high-pressure situation Nora had ever shared with her. Then she stepped back from the door. The room had the organized quality of a space that had been converted into a functional work environment by someone who knew what they were doing. One bed, used on one side only. The desk buried under a layered arrangement of documents, a laptop, 2 external drives, a printed spreadsheet that had been annotated extensively in red pen, and a city map that had been pinned to the wall with pushpins. 3 of the pushpins had circles drawn around them. Nora looked at the map without moving toward it. "How long have you been here?" 3 weeks? Yara sat on the edge of the bed. She moved with a carefulness that was not just exhaustion. There was something in the way she lowered herself that suggested a specific physical caution. "Farrell told you the shape of it?" "Enough." Nora sat in the desk chair, not the bed. She wanted to face the room. "Tell me the rest," Yara told her. It took 40 minutes, and when it was finished, Nora understood why Yara had been running it alone and why she couldn't keep doing so much longer. The framework was this: medical supply procurement from Linden Base had been systematically inflated over a 22-month period. Equipment costs misrepresented, quantities falsified, vendor contracts directed to 2 shell companies that didn't exist in any legitimate registry. The money had moved through 3 accounts in a way that was sophisticated enough to survive routine audit and obvious enough. Once you knew where to look, to be clearly intentional. The 2 names in the chain of command were a colonel named Price and a logistics director named Wentworth, both of whom had enough institutional presence to make a complaint from inside the system extremely hazardous for the person making it. The contact in Denton Falls was a federal financial crimes investigator named Agent Cassidy, who had been quietly building a parallel case and needed a verified source willing to provide sworn documentation. "Why Denton Falls?" Nora said. "Cassidy is based here, and Wentworth has a connection here, a business interest that became relevant when I was tracing the shell company structures." Yara leaned back against the headboard. "I've been watching the connection for 3 weeks. 3 days ago, someone started watching me." Nora looked up from the spreadsheet she had been reading. "What kind of watching?" 2 men, different vehicles, not sequential, no obvious pattern. But the timing relative to my movements is not coincidental. Yara said it with the neutral precision of someone reporting observation data rather than expressing fear about it. The precision was the tell, actually, because underneath it was the particular tightness of someone who had been managing fear by converting it into information for too long. "I made one of them this morning outside the gas station. He made me making him, and he didn't move. That's not surveillance. That's a message." "How long before you meet with Cassidy?" "She wanted to meet Thursday." 2 days, Nora said. 2 days, Yara confirmed. "I need someone with me. Not for the meeting. Cassidy is solid, that's the safe part. Getting to the meeting, and the 24 hours before it." She looked at Nora directly. "I need someone who understands the kind of situation this is and can move in it." Nora looked at the map on the wall, the 3 pinned circles, the red pen annotations, the organized, careful construction of 8 months of work by a person operating alone in a situation that had gotten heavy enough to require backup. "I have a day shift tomorrow," she said. "I know. 7 to 7. "I'll be fine until you're done," Yara said. "I've been managing it alone. I just need you in the picture." "I'm in the picture," Nora said. Yara exhaled. It was a very small sound, barely audible, but it was the exhale of someone who had been carrying something alone and had just for the first time in a while felt the weight shift by a fraction. "You look different," Yara said. "I've been a nurse for 4 years. That's not what I mean. Nora looked at her. You look like you've been trying to stop being yourself, Yara said. Not unkindly, just accurately. I've been trying to be a different version of myself, Nora said. There's a distinction. Is there? Nora didn't answer that. She turned back to the spreadsheet and read for another 20 minutes while Yara closed her eyes, not sleeping, just resting, the operational rest of someone who had learned to take it in small quantities rather than all at once. At 12:30, Nora left the motel. She sat in her car for a moment in the parking lot, looking at the gas station across the street, which was lit and empty except for one attendant visible through the glass. A dark sedan sat at the edge of the lot, angled toward the motel. She looked at it for 10 seconds. The car had not been there when she arrived. She could not see the driver clearly. The interior was dark, and the angle of the lot lighting was wrong. She put her car in gear, drove to the lot's exit, and turned onto the state route without looking back. But she noted the sedan's plate. The day shift at Caldwell Regional was the kind of shift that didn't give her room to think about anything else, which was both useful and its own particular problem. 12 hours of forward motion, every decision immediate, every complication requiring attention now rather than later. No cognitive space for anything that wasn't directly in front of her. Dr. Briggs was on the floor at 9. He caught her at the nurse's station with the document he had been preparing since their conversation, a formal protocol compliance review, printed and paper-clipped with the specific energy of a man who had decided that paperwork was the instrument he wanted to use. He handed it to her in full view of 2 other nurses and a resident, which was intentional. I'll need your written response by end of week, he said. She took it. I'll have it to you by Thursday. I'd prefer Friday, actually. Give me time to review. Thursday, she said. She put the document in her locker and went back to work. At 2 in the afternoon, she stepped outside to the hospital's employee parking area to eat something. She had a sandwich from the vending machine in 6 minutes before the next chart needed her. And she saw the dark sedan. Different plate than last night. Same model, same color, same approximate vintage. Parked 2 rows from her car, facing the hospital entrance. She stood very still for 3 seconds. Then she ate her sandwich and went back inside. And when she was back at the nurse's station, she sent Yara a message. Dark sedan, different plate, outside my workplace. Don't leave the room until I'm done at 7. Confirm. Yara's response came 11 minutes later. Confirmed. Second one outside this morning. They're not hiding anymore. That was significant. Surveillance that stops hiding is surveillance that has moved into a different mode. It has become presence rather than observation, which meant the purpose had changed from gathering information to applying pressure. She finished the shift. She checked on a man recovering from acute appendicitis, managed a pediatric febrile seizure, argued briefly and successfully with an insurance line about a scan authorization, and at 5:45 responded to a code in room 7 that resolved after 6 minutes and left her hand steady and her brain running the specific postcode calculation that she always ran, checking the decisions against the outcomes, looking for the things she could have done earlier or differently. At 6:50, she signed out and went to her car. The sedan was gone. She drove to the Sunrise Inn without stopping. Yara was at the window when she knocked. She had been watching the lot. Nora could tell from the way she moved, the quick assessment when the door opened, the scan of the parking area that happened before she looked at Nora directly. You saw the second car, Nora said. This morning. It sat outside for 2 hours and then left. Yara moved back to the desk. The documents had been reorganized. The red pen spreadsheet was now on top, and a second city map, smaller, had been added to the wall. I called Cassidy. What did she say? She moved the meeting up. Tomorrow, 7 a.m. There's a coffee shop on Glenfield called Birch and Morley. She'll be at the corner table. Nora looked at the new map. That's earlier than I expected. She said she's been picking up movement on her end, too. Someone flagged her case number through an internal system, which she's treating as a compromise. Yara sat down. Her face was doing the thing it did when she was running calculations. The slight narrowing around the eyes, the very small tension in the jaw. She wants the documentation transferred tomorrow, before whatever is happening on their end develops further. Okay, Nora said. Tonight you're not alone. I'll be in the next room. Yara looked at her. You don't have to. I'm not doing it because I have to. Nora picked up her bag and set it on the floor. I'm doing it because 2 cars outside 2 separate locations in one day is not coincidental, and you've been managing this alone long enough. Yara held her gaze for a moment. I don't need someone to manage me. I know. I'm not managing you. I'm covering your perimeter while you sleep. Yara was quiet for a beat. The room next door is available. I checked. Good. Nora moved toward the door. I'll get it. 7 a.m. tomorrow. Glenfield. Corner table. She paused in the doorway. Have you eaten today? Yara's silence was its own answer. I'll get food, Nora said. What do you want? Whatever. That's not a thing people actually want. Try again. Something crossed Yara's face that was almost but not quite a smile. Something with rice. There's a Filipino restaurant 3 blocks from here that smells extraordinary. That'll work? Nora left. She came back 40 minutes later with takeout containers, 2 waters, and a key fob for room 12. And they ate in Yara's room mostly without talking because both of them were people who understood that silence could be companionable rather than hostile. And there was enough spoken between them already to fill the quiet adequately. At 10, Nora moved to room 12 and slept. She slept lightly, the way she had learned to sleep. Surface down, ears open, the machinery of her nervous system set to alert rather than off. She had a specific internal clock that woke her at intervals she didn't choose consciously, but that she had come to trust, and at 2:30 a.m. it woke her cleanly, and she lay in the dark and listened. The parking lot was quiet. Traffic from the state route, intermittent, the gas station's HVAC unit cycling. And then, at the edge of audibility, footsteps on the walkway outside, moving slowly, the deliberate slowness of someone trying not to be heard. She was out of bed before the sound fully registered. She did not turn a light on. She moved to the window and looked through the gap between the curtain edge and the frame. 2 men. Moving past her door in the direction of room 11. She had her shoes on and her hand on the door handle in the same moment that the knock on Yara's door came. Not a loud knock, the kind designed to wake someone, but a specific kind of sustained pressure knock, patient and deliberate. She pulled the door open. The first man turned before she was fully in the walkway. He was large, not unusually, just the density of someone with training. He registered her presence with an expression that was professional and completely blank. Wrong room, she said. He looked at her. Ma'am, this doesn't concern you. The woman in room 11 is someone I know, so it concerns me. The second man, who had his hand raised to knock again, turned now too. Behind him, Yara's door hadn't opened, which meant Yara was at the wall beside it, rather than near the handle, which was correct. We just need to talk to her, the first man said. 2 o'clock in the morning is an unusual time for a conversation, Nora said. Who do you work for? Neither of them answered that. Their positioning had shifted. Not dramatically, but she felt it, the weight redistribution of 2 people making a decision about how a situation was going to go. I'm a nurse, she said. I also have a very specific set of skills from a prior professional life, and I would strongly prefer that we have an actual conversation right now, rather than whatever alternative you're currently considering. The first man looked at her for a long beat, and then, from somewhere in the parking lot behind her, a car door opened. She did not turn around, but she heard it, and she heard the footsteps, and she was already recalculating when a voice said, from behind her, Dale Vickers, Denton Falls PD, everyone stay right where you are. She turned. Dale Vickers was standing at the edge of the parking lot in civilian clothes, dark jacket, jeans, badge clipped to his belt where he wanted it visible. He had his hands loose at his sides and his weight forward, and he was looking at the scene in front of him with an expression that was calibrated to communicate authority rather than surprise, which meant he had not arrived here accidentally. He had known exactly where to come. The 2 men near Yara's door shifted their posture in a way that was not relief exactly, but recognition, the body language of people who had just been joined by someone they were expecting. Nora understood the geometry of the situation in the span of about 2 seconds, and what she understood was this. Vickers was not here in any official capacity that had been dispatched through a chain of command. He was here because he was connected to the men in the parking lot, and the men in the parking lot were connected to whatever Yara had been tracking for 8 months. And the fact that Dale Vickers, a Denton Falls police officer who ran a martial arts gym on Maplecroft Street, was standing in this parking lot at 2:30 a.m. told her something about the local dimension of Yara's case that she had not yet fully mapped. Voss, Vickers said. He said it the same way he said everything, with the particular flatness of a man who had decided a long time ago that his voice was a tool and tools shouldn't carry excess weight. You keep showing up in inconvenient places. I'm sleeping in the room next door, she said. That's not inconvenient, that's geography. Who's in 11? A friend. What kind of friend? The kind that's none of your business. She kept her voice even. She was running a count in her head. 3 men total, 2 near the door, Vickers at the lot's edge. The distance between herself and Vickers was approximately 12 feet. The walkway was lit by a single overhead fixture that was doing about 60% of its rated job. Behind Yara's door there was silence, which meant Yara was positioned and waiting and had made the correct assessment that staying out of the doorway was right. Vickers walked toward her. Not fast. Measured, the pace of someone who wants the approach itself to communicate something. I'm going to need you to step aside, he said. You're off duty, she said. You're not in uniform, you don't have a partner, and you drove here in a personal vehicle. Whatever you're here for tonight, it's not official. Something moved behind his eyes. She had seen it before in the gym, the recalculation, the moment when a man who has been operating from a position of assumed authority encounters resistance that is both calm and informed, and has to decide what to do with the fact that the resistance is not going to be managed the way he expected. Step aside, Voss. No, she said. The first man near the door moved. He moved toward her rather than the door, which was either a tactical decision or an impulsive one. She didn't have enough information to determine which, and it didn't matter, because the outcome was the same. He was large, and he moved quickly, and he reached for her left arm with his right hand. She was inside his reach before the grip fully closed. What followed was not elegant. That was important. It was not a clean technique from a controlled sparring session. It was the specific messiness of a real physical confrontation in low light, on uneven pavement where she had about 3 seconds to resolve a situation before it escalated past the point where resolution was clean. She redirected his momentum, used his own forward weight to take him off his base, and put him down on the asphalt with enough controlled force that he landed on his side and stayed there for a breath-catching moment. The second man was already moving. She got her forearm up in time to deflect his grab, took a hit to her left shoulder that was hard enough to matter, and stepped into his space rather than away from it, which was counterintuitive and correct, because at close range his size was a liability rather than an advantage. She controlled his wrist, applied a joint lock that was technically a come-along and practically a statement, and held him there. 3 seconds, total. The first man was starting to get up. Vickers had not moved from where he stood. He was watching with an expression that had passed through surprise and arrived somewhere more complicated. Nora released the second man's wrist and stepped back. I'm going to say this once, she said. Her breathing was elevated but controlled. Her shoulder hurt. Everyone who doesn't have official business here needs to get in their cars and drive away. Now. Tonight. I am a licensed medical professional, and I am also someone with a prior professional background that you are currently not accounting for, and the next time someone puts a hand on me, I am not going to be as careful about the outcome. Silence. The first man on the ground had made it to one knee. He was looking at Vickers, waiting. Vickers looked at Nora for a long moment. I was reassessing. She could see it happening in real time, the revision of whatever category he had placed her in over the weeks at Iron Crest, the accommodation of new data that did not fit the previous model. This isn't over, he said. It was quiet. It was not quite a threat, more like a statement of intent that he wanted on record. Go home, Vickers, she said. He held her gaze for 3 more seconds. Then he turned and walked back to his car, and the 2 men followed him, and the parking lot was empty by the time Yara's door opened 6 inches. Clear? Yara said. Clear. Yara came out. She assessed the parking lot with a single scan, looked at Nora's left shoulder and said, How bad? Bruised. Nothing structural. Nothing structural. Nora rotated the shoulder twice. It moved through its full range with pain, but without the grinding resistance that would have indicated something worse. Vickers was one of them. I heard. Yara looked in the direction of the lot exit. That's the local connection I couldn't close. I knew there was a law enforcement component in Denton Falls, but I couldn't identify the individual. She paused. He's going to move faster now. I know. We need to get to Cassidy before he can build a counter-narrative. 7 a.m. Nora said. We have 4 hours. Get some sleep. I mean it. Actual sleep, not operational rest. You need cognitive function tomorrow. Yara looked at her with the expression she used when she was deciding whether an argument was worth having. There's a chair in my room, she said finally. You can have the bed. You're the one who just went hands-on. I'm fine in 12. Voss? Moss? A beat. Fine, Yara said. She went back inside. Nora stood in the parking lot for another 2 minutes, watching the lot exit, letting her heart rate come down the rest of the way. Her shoulder was already stiffening. She pressed 2 fingers against the point of impact and felt the specific dull bloom of a deep bruise establishing itself. She had been hit harder. She had been hurt worse. This was manageable. What was not manageable was the revised timeline, and she knew it. They were at Birch and Morley on Glenfield at 6:40. The coffee shop was the kind of place that had been operating since before third wave coffee was a concept, and had therefore achieved a form of authenticity that newer establishments paid designers to approximate. Worn wooden countertops, mismatched chairs, a chalkboard menu that looked like it had been written by the same hand for 20 years. At 6:40 it was populated by early commuters, a small cluster of college students with laptops, and the particular category of person who treats a coffee shop like an office because a coffee shop is cheaper than an office. Agent Renata Cassidy was already at the corner table. She was 44 years old, with the compact, economical bearing of someone who had been doing difficult work for a long time and had stopped performing ease about it. She had a federal badge in her jacket pocket that Nora could identify by the slight weight differential in the fabric, and a coffee she had not touched, and a phone face down on the table, and she looked at Nora and Yara as they approached with the assessment scan of someone running their own evaluation. You're Voss, she said to Nora, before anyone introduced themselves. Yara called you, Nora said. Last night, after your situation in the parking lot. Cassidy looked at Nora's shoulder. The way Nora was holding it, slightly protected, the unconscious accommodation of impact pain. You okay? Fine. What do you know about Dale Vickers? Cassidy's expression shifted a small increment. Sit down. They sat. Vickers has been on my peripheral radar for 6 months, Cassidy said, keeping her voice at a conversational level. The ambient noise of the coffee shop covered them adequately. He has financial connections to one of Wentworth's shell structures. Not direct, routed through a property management company. He was useful as a local facilitator, moving communications, making introductions, providing a certain kind of pressure when needed. He's a police officer, Nora said. Which is precisely why he's useful, Cassidy said. A badge is a door opener, and in this case it's also institutional cover. She looked at Yara. The documentation you have, is it complete? Enough to establish the procurement fraud across all 22 months, Yara said. She set the external drive on the table. It was a small thing, unremarkable, the kind of drive that could be purchased at any electronics store. What was on it was not unremarkable. The shell company structure, the account transfers, the falsified vendor contracts, and the communications chain connecting Price and Wentworth to the authorization sequence. Communications chain, Cassidy said. 41 messages over 14 months, some email, some encrypted platform. Yara broke the encryption 6 weeks ago, Nora said. Cassidy looked at Yara. You broke the encryption. It took a while, Yara said. Cassidy reached for her coffee for the first time. She turned the cup between her hands. The case I've been building from the financial side has standing, but it's circumstantial in the communications layer. What you have closes that gap. She paused. Once I submit this through the federal oversight track, Price and Wentworth will know the submission has been made within 24 hours. Maybe less, if the compromise I identified in my case system is deeper than I've mapped. How long between submission and protection? Nora said. For Yara? 48 hours minimum before I can get her formally into a federal witness structure. Cassidy set the coffee down. That's a window. A window Vickers already knows about, Nora said, given that he was in that parking lot last night. Cassidy nodded once. It was the nod of someone confirming a calculation they had already run. I'm going to need you both somewhere defensible for the next 48 hours, not the motel. I have a day shift in 3 hours, Nora said. Both Cassidy and Yara looked at her. I'm not abandoning a shift at a trauma hospital because of a 48-hour timeline, Nora said. Yara comes with me. The hospital is a controlled environment, multiple points of access with staff verification, security on every floor. If Vickers or anyone connected to him tries to move during the day, they're moving in a building with a dozen witnesses and cameras on every corridor. Cassidy thought about this. It's unconventional. It works, Nora said. Caldwell Regional has a staff break room on the third floor that requires a badge to access. Yara stays there. I'm on the floor. You have the drive. You start the submission process. We get through the day shift, and tonight you have whatever federal resources you can mobilize. It was not a perfect plan. Nora was aware of that, aware of the specific ways it could fracture, the points of exposure. But the alternative was pulling Yara into a location that would take time to identify and secure, and time was the thing they did not have in excess. Okay, Cassidy said. She took the drive. I'll start the process as soon as I'm back in my office. You have my number. Any movement from Vickers, any contact, you call me directly. She paused. Voss, how much does your hospital administration know about the situation you're currently in? Nothing, Nora said. Cassidy nodded again. The expression on her face communicated that she was not entirely comfortable with this and was proceeding anyway, which Nora respected as an honest position. They left the coffee shop at 7:10. The morning was cold and gray, and the traffic on Glenfield was building toward the day's first serious congestion. Nora drove with the heat on and her shoulder aching, and the particular alertness of someone who is tracking multiple things simultaneously and cannot afford to let any of them drop. Yara sat in the passenger seat. She was looking at the side mirror. We have a tail, she said. Nora checked the rear view. The gray SUV 2 cars back had matched their last 2 turns. How long? Since we left the coffee shop. Vickers? Different vehicle. Could be one of the 2 from last night. Yara's voice was even. She was running her own calculations. How far to the hospital? 8 minutes. Can you lose them in 7? Nora took a left where she should have gone straight, immediately cut through a gas station's parking area, and came out on a parallel street that put 2 blocks and a one-way grid between them and the SUV. Yes, she said. Long. Caldwell Regional's employee entrance required a badge scan and, during high-security protocols, an ID check at the reception desk. Nora had worked through 3 different security upgrade phases since she started. The hospital took access control seriously in ways that were occasionally frustrating and now, for the first time, felt like genuine infrastructure. She brought Yara in as a family member, accompanying an employee to retrieve a personal item. The security guard at the desk, an older man named Terrence, who had worked the entrance since before Nora started, checked her badge, glanced at Yara with the practiced incuriosity of someone who had processed thousands of brief, unremarkable visits, and waved them through. The third-floor break room had 4 chairs, a couch, 2 vending machines, and a wall-mounted television that was usually showing either cable news or a cooking competition, depending on who had gotten there first. At 7:45 in the morning, it was empty. Nora set Yara up with a coffee, a phone charger, and the code to the badge reader. If you need to move, text me first. Don't go into the main corridors without me. I've done more complicated things in more hostile environments, Yara said. I know, I'm saying it anyway. Nora picked up her bag. Don't eat whatever is in the second vending machine. The turkey sandwich has been there since Thursday, and I don't know whose Thursday. She went to work. The shift moved the way shifts moved when her attention was divided, faster than usual, the way time compresses when the mind is running 2 tracks simultaneously. She was present for everything in front of her. The chest pain in Bay 2, the laceration repair on a construction worker who had opinions about how much lidocaine he needed, the pediatric fever workup that turned out to be a straightforward ear infection requiring 8 minutes of parent reassurance. But underneath all of it, she was maintaining the other track, the awareness of where Yara was and what Cassidy was doing, and how much time had passed since the drive left their hands and began moving through federal channels. At 10:15, Dr. Briggs appeared at the nurse's station with the particular energy of a man who had been planning a conversation. Voss, my office. Now is good. I have a patient in Bay 3 who needs a wound check in 10 minutes. Nurse Delaney can cover it. She looked at him. He was standing with his hands in his coat pockets and his chin at the specific angle of a man who had decided that the conversation he wanted to have was more important than the clinical environment they were both operating in, and she recognized the configuration as one she had navigated before, not in hospitals, in other places. And she knew that the correct response was not to defer and not to escalate, but to hold the line with the minimum energy required. "I'll come to your office in 10 minutes, she said, after the wound check. He looked at her for 3 seconds. Then he turned and walked away. Nurse Delaney, Sandra, 26, 2 years out of school, and still occasionally trying to figure out where the political lines in the department were, looked at Nora from across the desk. "He's not going to like that." "No," Nora agreed. "He's not." She did the wound check. It needed 2 additional sutures that the previous shift had left open pending evaluation, and she placed them cleanly and documented the reasoning, and then washed her hands and went to Briggs's office. He had the protocol document on his desk. He also had a second document she hadn't seen before, a formal complaint form, partially completed. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "I want to be direct," Briggs said. He leaned back in his chair with the authority of a man in his own space. "The ketamine incident is one piece of a pattern I've been observing. You exceed your scope routinely. You override physician decisions. You make calls that are not yours to make, and you do it without apparent concern for the hierarchy that exists in this department for very specific reasons. The reasons being," she said, "accountability, liability, patient safety." The patient in Bay 4 had a pain crisis that was escalating toward cardiovascular involvement. Dr. Rowe was occupied with a chest decompression. The anesthesiologist was in surgery. I made a judgment call with the information available, and the patient's outcome supported the call. "That's not the point." "Then I'm unclear on what the point is," she said. "Because from where I'm sitting, the point is that a patient needed intervention. Intervention was available, and I provided it. If the outcome had been different, you'd have a legitimate conversation about scope. The outcome was not different." Briggs looked at her with the expression of a man who has prepared for resistance, but not for this specific form of it. Not argument, not apology, just an even and direct accounting that didn't give him the emotional texture he needed to work with. "I'm placing you on a performance review," he said. 30 days. Any further incidents during that period will result in escalation to the nursing board. She looked at the partially completed complaint form on his desk. "Okay," she said. She meant it. Not as submission, as acknowledgement that this was the game he had chosen to play, and she had enough going on today to let him play it. She stood up. "We're not finished," he said. "I have patience," she said. She left. At 11:40, her phone buzzed in her scrub's pocket. She stepped into the supply corridor to check it. It was from a number she didn't recognize. The message was 4 words, "Tell Moss to run." She stared at the message for 2 seconds. Then she walked to the stairwell at a pace that was fast enough to get there quickly and slow enough not to trigger the specific alertness that unusual behavior in a hospital corridor produced in the people who worked there. She hit the 3rd floor at a run. The badge reader outside the break room beeped green when she swiped it, and she pushed through the door, and Yara was not on the couch. She was at the room's single window, looking down at the parking lot. Her posture was the posture of someone who has seen something and is currently deciding what to do about it. "What happened?" Nora said. "Vickers is in the parking lot," Yara said. "He's been there for 20 minutes, and he's not alone." She turned from the window. "Cassidy's not picking up." Nora looked at the window, then at Yara. "How many?" "3 that I can see. Vickers and 2 others, different from last night. He can't come in here without cause. He'd need to badge in, and he doesn't have hospital access." "He's a police officer," Yara said. "He can manufacture cause." "Not without documentation, not without a warrant, not without a chain of command that knows he's here, which means paperwork that creates a record, which means he's exposing himself to exactly the kind of scrutiny that Cassidy's case creates problems for." Nora was thinking out loud, running the logic forward. "He can sit in the parking lot. He can't come in." "So we're contained," Yara said. It was not panicked. It was precise. "We're controlled," Nora said. "There's a difference." She tried Cassidy's number. It rang twice and went to voicemail. She tried again. Voicemail. "She might be in the submission process," Yara said. "Federal systems are not known for allowing distraction during intake." "Or something is wrong on her end," Nora said. They looked at each other. The break room was quiet. Somewhere down the hall, the elevator chimed, and the ambient sounds of a hospital floor, the PA system, the distant conversation, the specific rhythm of equipment, continued unchanged, indifferent to what was happening in this particular room. I need to know something, Nora said. The communications chain, the 41 messages. Is the drive the only copy? Yara paused one beat. No. Where's the backup? Yara reached into her jacket and produced a second drive. It was smaller than the first, a thumbnail drive, barely visible in her palm. I've had it since week 2, Yara said. I didn't tell Cassidy because I needed something that wasn't in federal hands yet, in case the federal system was more compromised than she knew. Nora looked at the drive. Then she made a decision. Give it to me, she said. Yara looked at her. Why? Because if something happens to you in the next 48 hours, the backup disappears with you. If I have it, it's in 2 places. She held out her hand. I'm on the inside of this building. They can watch the exits, but they can't get to me without generating the kind of record that hurts them. You're the one they're actually here for. Yara held the drive for a moment. She was running her own calculation. Nora could see it, the precise weighing of trust against operational logic. She placed the drive in Nora's hand. Nora closed her fingers around it. It was warm from Yara's jacket. She put it in the inner pocket of her scrubs, behind the ID badge, and pressed her hand flat against her chest for a second to confirm it was seated. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from the main hospital entrance desk. From Terrence, officer at the front, says he has a welfare check on a visitor. You want to come down? She read it twice. Then she looked up at Yara. He's inside, she said. Yara went completely still. Nora was already moving toward the door when her radio crackled. The departmental radio, the one that was supposed to carry only clinical communications. And what came through it was not a clinical communication. It was Dale Vickers' voice. Attention Caldwell Regional Staff. I'm Officer Dale Vickers, Denton Falls PD. I'm conducting an official welfare check for a patient's family member currently on premises. I need staff assistance at the 3rd floor nursing station immediately. He had gotten inside. He had a radio on the hospital's departmental frequency. And somewhere between the front entrance and the 3rd floor, the 37 steps of distance between Nora and the nursing station, Dale Vickers had already begun rewriting the terms of the situation. Nora did not run. Running in a hospital corridor produced a specific social signal. It told every person who saw it that something was wrong, and wrong in a clinical sense, which would pull staff toward the problem rather than creating the kind of neutral space she needed to move through. She walked fast, which in a hospital was simply the default speed of someone with somewhere urgent to be, and she was at the 3rd floor nursing station in 40 seconds. Vickers was there. I was standing at the station counter with the specific posture of a man who has calculated exactly how much authority his presence generates and has positioned himself to maximize it. He had his badge visible and his voice at the register of professional courtesy, the practiced register of someone who understood that in institutional settings, tone was the mechanism of control. The nurse at the station was a man named Obi, 28, who had started at Caldwell Regional 8 months ago and was still in the phase where he gave official-looking people the benefit of the doubt before he had reason not to. Officer Vickers, Nora said. He turned. His expression did something small and controlled. Nurse Voss, just the person. Obi, I've got this, she said to the nurse at the desk. Obi looked between them with the expression of someone who could feel that the air was wrong but couldn't identify the specific pressure change. He stepped back from the counter. What can I do for you? Nora said to Vickers. I have a welfare check on a visitor. Woman named Yara Moss, believed to be on this floor. He said it pleasantly. He had a notepad, which was a prop. She could see that it was unused. Just need to confirm she's safe and accounted for. Welfare checks require documentation, she said. Who initiated it? A concerned party. That's not documentation. That's a description of documentation. She kept her voice at the same register he was using. Professional, even. The voice of 2 people having a routine conversation that happened to be about a very specific thing. If you have a formal welfare check, I'll need the case number and the initiating officer's name so I can log it in our visitor registry. A beat. That's not standard protocol for a simple welfare check. It is at this facility. Since the security upgrade in March, all official law enforcement welfare checks require case number documentation before we can provide visitor location information. She looked at him directly. If you have the number, I can process it at the desk right now. He did not have a number. She had invented the March security upgrade, but she had delivered it with the specific confidence of someone citing an institutional policy that existed in a document somewhere, and that confidence was doing approximately 80% of the work. "I can have the number in 10 minutes, he said. "When you have it, come back to the desk and ask for me specifically," she said. "I'll be on the floor." She turned and walked back toward the East Wing corridor. She made it 12 steps before he said, behind her, "I know she's here, Voss." She stopped, did not turn. "Lots of people are here. It's a hospital." "I know what she's carrying, and I know you know what she's carrying." His voice had dropped, no longer performing for the institutional audience, just talking to her. "You have until I get that case number to make a better decision." She turned. He was still at the desk, but the performance of courtesy had dropped off his face, and what was underneath it was less managed. "Here's what I know," she said, walking back toward him so the conversation stayed contained. She stopped close enough that it required him to hold his ground, which he did, but the effort of it was just barely visible. "I know that you drove to a motel at 2:30 in the morning in your personal vehicle with two men who are not law enforcement. I know that when one of those men put his hands on me, you watched. And I know that whatever you're doing in this building right now is not a welfare check. Careful," he said. "Quiet." "I'm always careful," she said. "That's the thing about me that you keep failing to account for." She walked back to the East Wing. This time, he didn't call after her. She found Yara where she had left her, in the break room, standing to the left of the window, not visible from outside, watching the parking lot through the glass's edge. Nora came in and closed the door and stood for a moment running the next hour forward in her mind. "He doesn't have documentation," she said. "He has presence, which is a different tool. He's going to generate the paperwork, and when he has it, he'll be back, and at that point I can't block him with procedure." "How long?" 20 minutes. Maybe 30, if the system is slow today." She looked at Yara. "Cassidy?" Still nothing. Yara's jaw was tight, not fear, the specific tension of someone who has run out of controlled variables. She could be in submission. She could be compromised. I can't tell from here. We have to assume she's in submission and operating. And if she's not, then we're operating without a net. Nora thought for 3 seconds. The backup drive. If Cassidy's system is compromised, the submission she made with the primary drive might be intercepted or delayed. The backup needs to go somewhere else, a different channel. What channel? Nora reached into her scrubs pocket and turned the thumbnail drive between her fingers. She was thinking about the shape of the institutional landscape in Denton Falls, the overlapping jurisdictions, the pressure points, the places where information could move outside the channels that Vickers and the people above him could influence. "The Denton Falls Examiner," she said. Yara looked at her. "A newspaper. A newspaper that has been running investigative pieces on municipal financial practices for 18 months. I read their work. The journalist who runs that beat is named Whitmore. She has a working relationship with federal sources that she's documented in her pieces. If she receives the drive with documentation context, she can't publish immediately, but she creates a record outside the system, which means even if Cassidy's submission is interrupted, the data exists in a location that Price and Wentworth can't access through official channels." "That's not a clean move," Yara said. "No, but clean isn't the current situation." Nora closed her hand around the drive. "I need 15 minutes off this floor. Can you stay contained that long?" Yara looked at her for a moment that was less deliberation than confirmation, confirming that she was trusting Nora's read of the situation, which was a distinct thing from agreeing with it. "Go," she said. Sandra Delaney was at the medication cart near Bay 7 when Nora found her. Nora pulled her 2 steps into the corridor alcove. "I need a favor that I cannot explain right now," she said. Sandra had been a nurse for 2 years. In those 2 years, she had developed the specific calibration of someone who had learned to distinguish between requests that were strange and requests that were wrong, and to treat those categories differently. "Okay," she said, "there's a woman in the 3rd floor break room. If anyone comes to that door while I'm gone, anyone, including anyone with a badge, I need you to be very slow with your key card, in a way that gives me time to get back." She paused. "You'd be slowing down a man named Vickers, who is misusing his authority in this building, and I will explain everything to you after today is over." Sandra looked at her. "Is she safe, the woman in the break room?" "She will be," Nora said. "That's what I'm working on." Another beat. My keycard reader sticks sometimes, Sandra said. I've been meaning to get it looked at. Thank you, Nora said. She went to the hospital's administrative wing on the first floor, which had a computer terminal accessible to registered staff for documentation purposes, and she drafted an email using the professional address that the hospital provided to all clinical staff. She addressed it to Kay Whitmore at the Denton Falls Examiner. She did not attach the drive. She described its contents in terms that were specific enough to establish credibility and general enough not to constitute the submission itself. She included her name, her nursing license number, and her direct phone number. She noted that a federal financial crimes investigator named Cassidy was working a parallel track and that the physical documentation was in federal custody, and that she was providing this contact as a secondary verification point in the event of interference with the primary submission process. She sent it. Then she pulled the drive from her pocket and looked at it for a moment. She was making a decision about where to put it that was not her pocket, not the break room, and not anywhere that a welfare check could produce a justification to search. She went to the hospital pharmacy on the ground floor and spoke to the pharmacist on duty, a woman named Dr. Olamide Eze, who had worked at Caldwell Regional for 9 years and who Nora had a functional working relationship with, built from 100 small professional interactions and one specific incident 2 years ago when Nora had identified a near-miss dispensing error that Dr. Eze had caught and corrected before it reached a patient, and neither of them had forgotten it. I need you to hold something for me, Nora said. She set the drive on the counter. Not for long. Today. Dr. Eze looked at the drive, then at Nora. She was the kind of person who asked good questions rather than many questions. How hot is it? She said. Hot enough that I'd rather it not be in my pocket. Put it in the medication return bin, Dr. Eze said. No one goes in there without my key, and my key stays on me. Nora put the drive in the bin. She was back on the 3rd floor in 11 minutes. Vickers returned at the 22-minute mark with a case number. Nora verified it at the desk. It was real. She could see that it had been generated through the Denton Falls PD system, which meant he had called it in, and someone on duty had logged it without asking why a welfare check on a hospital visitor required a police officer in person rather than a phone call to hospital administration. She could not block him with procedure now. What she could do was be present for every second of it. I'll take you to the break room, she said. The visitor you're checking on is resting there. He walked beside her down the corridor. 2 other officers had appeared, uniformed, which was new, which meant Vickers had called for backup in the time between their conversation at the desk and now. They followed at a distance that was professional and deliberate. The break room door was closed. Sandra was at the medication cart 12 feet away, her back to the door, working through her cart with the specific focused slowness of someone concentrating hard on not being visibly slow. Nora badged the door open. Yara was sitting on the couch with a coffee cup in the posture of someone who has been waiting calmly, which was not a performance. It was the actual resting state of a person who had spent years operating in situations where composure was a survival tool. Vickers looked at her. Yara looked at him. The look between them lasted about 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds the temperature of the room was specific and charged. Ma'am, Vickers said, I have a welfare check on a Yara Moss. Can I confirm your name? Yara Moss, Yara said. Are you here voluntarily? I'm drinking hospital coffee, Yara said. Nothing about this is voluntary. One of the uniformed officers made a sound that was barely not a laugh. Vickers' expression did not change. I need you to come with me for some questions, he said. About what? Yara said. A matter related to, do I have a legal obligation to come with you? Vickers paused. 1 beat. You're not under arrest at this time. Then I'll stay where I am. Yara looked at him with the flat, direct look that Nora knew was not hostility, just the expression of a person who has decided to occupy exactly the space she is legally permitted to occupy, and not 1 inch less. When you have a reason I'm legally obligated to respond to, let me know. Vickers looked at Nora. Nora looked back at him with an expression she kept deliberately neutral. This isn't over, he said. You've said that before, Nora said. He left. The uniformed officers followed. The door closed. In the silence, Yara exhaled once through her nose. He's going to come back with something that gives him actual authority. I know, Nora said. We have however long that takes. Her phone buzzed. Cassidy. She answered immediately. Tell me you're operational. I'm operational. Cassidy's voice was slightly rough, the quality of someone who had been talking intensively for hours. The submission went through at 11:40. We have federal oversight, Inspector General's office, military branch. They're pulling Price and Wentworth's records as of 30 minutes ago. Vickers is in this building, Nora said. He has a welfare check on Yara. A pause. Is it documented? Case number, yes. Okay, I'm sending 2 federal agents to your location. They'll be there in... Cassidy's voice shifted. She was talking to someone else. Then came back. 25 minutes. Do not let her leave that building before they arrive. Understood. Nora looked at Yara. 25 minutes. Yara nodded. The 25 minutes were not quiet. Vickers came back at the 15-minute mark. This time he had a document, a formal request for voluntary questioning signed by his supervising sergeant, which was not an arrest warrant or a compelled appearance order, but which carried the weight of official paper and 2 uniformed officers and the general institutional pressure that official paper carried when most people encountered it. Most people. Nora read the document at the break room door. She read it fully, which took approximately 90 seconds, during which Vickers stood in the corridor with his arms at his sides and his jaw carrying the specific tension of a man containing impatience. This is a voluntary request, she said. Correct. Voluntary means she can decline. It means we'd strongly encourage her to cooperate. Encouragement isn't compulsion. She handed the document back. When you have a compelled appearance order, we'll reconsider. Vickers took the document. He looked at her for a moment, not the calculating look from before, something more direct. You understand that what you're doing right now has consequences. I'm protecting a visitor's legal rights in a medical facility, she said. That has no consequences for me. I'm not talking about legal consequences. She held his gaze. I know you're not. He looked at her, really looked at her, in the way he had not quite done before, the way that happened when the accumulated evidence of who someone was finally broke through the category they'd been placed in. Nora the nurse, Nora the beginner who showed up in scrubs, Nora the woman who needed to learn her place in his gym. Who are you? He said, quietly. Not aggressive, something between that and genuine. And, someone you underestimated, she said. She closed the break room door. Inside, she stood with her back against the door and looked at Yara and said, 10 minutes. The federal agents arrived in 9. They were not dramatic about it. That was the thing she noted. They did not come in loudly, did not announce themselves at the floor level in a way that generated spectacle. They came to the 3rd floor break room with their credentials and their specific quiet efficiency, and they introduced themselves to Yara with the functional courtesy of people who had a job to do and were doing it. One of them spoke briefly with Vickers in the corridor. Nora was not in the corridor for that conversation, but she could see it through the break room's small window. Vickers standing with the 2 uniformed officers, the federal agent speaking to him with the document that established federal jurisdiction over the matter, Vickers' posture going through several small phases that tracked, in sequence, from resistance to recalculation to a kind of stillness that was not acceptance, but was the thing that preceded it. He left without coming back to the break room. Yara was formally taken into federal protective custody at 12:47 p.m. She stood up from the couch and picked up her jacket and looked at Nora. And for a moment, they were just 2 people standing in a break room that smelled like old coffee and institutional carpet, and all the operational architecture dropped away, and it was just that. Thank you, Yara said. She did not say it easily. It came out with the slightly effortful quality of a word that a person does not deploy casually. You did 8 months of work alone, Nora said. I covered a morning. It was a necessary morning. Get some sleep, Nora said. Actual sleep. The kind where you're not listening. Yara almost smiled. It was the same almost smile from the motel room, the one that had a whole history behind it. Then she walked out, flanked by the federal agents, and she did not look back, which was correct. Yara Moss had never been the kind of person who looked back. Nora stood in the empty break room for 30 seconds. Then she went back to work. The afternoon shift ran 7 more hours. She worked through them with the same forward-focused attention that had characterized the morning, but underneath it something had shifted. The second track was quieter now, the operational pressure at a lower register, and without it occupying as much processing space, she noticed things about the floor that she had been moving through too quickly to register. Sandra Delaney, who had spent 2 hours near that break room door with a mysteriously malfunctioning keycard, was working the late chart documentation with the focused energy of someone who had decided not to ask questions yet, but intended to get full answers eventually. Dr. Ansel Rowe, who had pulled the mass casualty shift with her 3 weeks ago, passed her in the corridor at 3:30 and said, "Heard Briggs is writing you up," and then without pausing added, "Also heard the ketamine call was correct, and the patient's cardiologist said so in documentation," and kept walking. The man from the appendicitis case 2 days ago, passing through on a follow-up, waved at her from across the waiting room. These were small things. She was aware that they were small things. She was also aware that in the specific kind of life she had been building for 4 years, quiet, functional, forward-facing, small things were actually what the structure was made of. At 6:15, Cassidy called. "Price and Wentworth," she said. "Federal holds as of 2 p.m. Military prosecutors are involved because of the Linden base dimension. This is going to take time to fully process, but they're not going to be in a position to interfere with anything from here." "Vickers?" Nora said. "Under investigation. He can't leave Denton Falls pending the inquiry, which means his badge is effectively suspended in everything but name until the review concludes." A pause. "He's going to have a very bad few months." "He made choices," Nora said. "He did." Another pause. "I know you went to the examiner." Nora was quiet. "I'm not criticizing it," Cassidy said. "Whitmore called me this afternoon. She's agreed to hold pending the federal process and then publish the full account when we give her clearance. She's also verified your account of the hospital situation, which becomes part of the public record when this goes to prosecution." A beat. "Your name is going to be in that story, Voss." "I know," Nora said. "You're okay with that?" She thought about it. "Not for long." "Yes." "Good. The backup drive. I need that in federal evidence." "I'll have it to you by end of today," she said. She thought about the pharmacy return bin and Dr. Easy's key and the 9 years of professional trust that had made that possible. "It's safe." She picked up the drive from Dr. Easy's pharmacy at 6:40, signed a chain of custody document that Dr. Ease produced with the efficiency of someone who had understood from the beginning that there might be paperwork, and drove to Cassidy's field office on Renner Street after her shift ended at 7. She handed the drive across a desk to a federal agent who logged it into evidence with the specific careful attention of a process that has consequences if done improperly, and she signed 2 more documents. And then she sat across from Cassidy in a room that had the characterless functionality of all federal workspace and gave a full statement that took an hour and 20 minutes. She did not omit anything: the gym, the parking lot, the hospital, Vickers' presence, the 2 men, the shoulder that was now deeply and considerably bruised and that she had been managing through the last 8 hours with ibuprofen, and the specific discipline of someone who had been trained to function through physical discomfort without letting it show on their face. Cassidy listened, took notes, asked 3 clarifying questions, all precise, all directly useful. At the end, she looked at Nora across the desk. "You had a prior career," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Nora said. "That's not in your current file anywhere." "That was intentional," Nora said. Cassidy looked at her for a moment. "The skills you demonstrated, in the parking lot, in that building today, those aren't nursing school." "No," Nora said. "They're not." Cassidy seemed to decide something. "I'm not going to ask about it in an official capacity, but I want you to know that what you did today, specifically the decision to put the backup in a location outside your direct custody while remaining accessible, the press contact as a secondary channel, the management of Vickers' access within the hospital's legal framework, that was not civilian thinking." "I've been a civilian for 4 years," Nora said. "I know, I can see it." Cassidy paused. "I can also see what was there before." Nora said nothing. "Thank you," Cassidy said, "for Yara, and for the rest of it." Nora nodded. She drove home. The apartment was quiet. She had not eaten since the vending machine sandwich at 2, and she was aware of that the way she was aware of the bruise. As data, as a condition requiring management. She made eggs and ate them standing at the counter because the table felt like too formal a commitment to sitting still, and she finished and washed the pan and stood at the kitchen window looking at the parking lot below. Her phone showed three texts she hadn't processed during the shift. One from Marcus. Shoulders better. Going back Thursday. You coming? One from the front desk girl at Ironcrest, whose name she had finally learned was Becca. A short message that read, I heard what happened at the gym Tuesday. I didn't say anything in the moment, but I should have. I'm sorry. One from a number she didn't have saved that turned out to be Carver, the blue belt, who wrote only, different class structure starting next week. New instructor. Thought you should know. She read each one. She set the phone down. She was aware, standing at that window, that the things she had been doing at Ironcrest, the showing up, the not backing down, the refusing to be managed out of a space she had a right to occupy, had generated a set of consequences that extended past the thing itself. She had not planned for them. She had simply done what the situation required, and the situation had turned out to be larger than it appeared when she walked in off the street with an enrollment form. Most situations were. She turned off the kitchen light and moved toward the bedroom. Her phone buzzed. She picked it up expecting Yara or Cassidy or a follow-up from the federal case. It was an unknown number, no name, local area code. The text read, your testimony tomorrow is a problem. The federal case has a gap you don't know about. Call this number before 9 a.m. or what happened to Moss tonight becomes the version of events that stands. She read it twice. Then she opened her call log and dialed Cassidy. The call went to voicemail. She called again. Voicemail. She stood in her dark bedroom with the phone in her hand and the bruise in her shoulder and the exhaustion of a 14-hour day that had contained considerably more than 14 hours of actual events. And she thought about the text. What happened to Moss tonight? Not what happens. Not a future threat. What happened? Past tense. She was already moving for her keys when her phone rang. It was Dominic Farrell. She answered. Farrell, she said. Voss. His voice was wrong. Not the controlled wrong of someone delivering bad news they had prepared. The uncontrolled wrong of someone calling because they didn't know what else to do. Yara is in Denton Falls General. She was in federal protective custody, in transport. The vehicle was hit 40 minutes ago. Driver is critical. The agents are stable. A pause that was too short to contain everything it needed to. Yara has a head injury. They don't know yet. Nora stood completely still. Which hospital? She said. Denton Falls General, Trauma Bay. I know where it is, she said. She grabbed her keys and her jacket and she was out the door before the call was fully ended. And as she ran down the apartment stairs, the text on her phone sat unread in her message log, its past tense burning in the dark of the screen behind her. Denton Falls General was 8 minutes from her apartment if you drove the speed limit. She made it in 5. She parked in the emergency bay's restricted zone and left the car there, and she was through the automatic doors before the security guard at the entrance had fully registered her presence. The trauma department at Denton Falls General was smaller than Caldwell Regional's, the layout different. She knew this because she had done a cross-facility training rotation here 3 years ago, and she had the kind of spatial memory that did not require conscious maintenance. Trauma Bay was left of the main desk, past the curtained alcoves, through the double doors that required either a badge or someone to buzz you through. A federal agent was standing outside those double doors. He was one of the two from the hospital. She recognized the jacket, the build. He had a bandage on his left forearm that was fresh enough to still be white, and he was standing with the posture of someone who had been injured and was refusing to acknowledge it past the minimum necessary treatment. Voss? He said. He had learned her name at some point during the day. How bad? She said. GCS of 12 on arrival. They've got her in imaging. He paused. The driver is in surgery. Blunt thoracic. We don't know yet. GCS of 12. 12 out of 15 on the Glasgow coma scale meant she was responsive, oriented to some degree, not in the worst territory. But head injuries were deceptive in the first hours, and the gap between 12 and 8 could close faster than anyone wanted to plan for. What hit the vehicle? She said. Pickup truck ran a red at 40 plus on the intersection of Harver and 9th. No skid marks. Driver walked away. The agent's jaw was tight. We're calling it deliberate pending investigation, but the pickup was reported stolen at 8 p.m. and the driver is currently unidentified. Nora looked at the double doors. I need to be in there. You're not on staff here. I have an active nursing license and a professional relationship with the patient, she said. And I have information about what put her in that bed tonight that your supervisors need before it gets any older. He looked at her for 2 seconds. Then he spoke into his radio, got a response she couldn't fully hear, and said, 5 minutes. Then I need you to wait out here while we secure the situation. She went through. Yara was in the second bay, half drawn, an attending physician. She didn't know running a neuroassessment, tracking, finger follow, grip strength on both sides. She was conscious, her eyes were open. There was a laceration above her right eyebrow that had been closed with steri strips as a temporary measure pending a full assessment, and the right side of her face was developing the bruised swelling of significant blunt impact. Yara's eyes found Nora's the moment she came through the curtain. "You drove fast," Yara said. Her voice was slightly slurred, not dramatically, just enough to indicate that the concussive component was real. "Don't talk," the attending said. "She can talk," Nora said. "Controlled conversation is not contraindicated in a 12. Cognitive engagement actually helps assess tracking." She looked at the attending, who was young and had the expression of someone about to establish hierarchy. "I'm a trauma nurse with 11 years in emergency medicine. I'm not overriding your assessment. I'm giving you information. Her speech clarity is a useful data point. Keep her talking in controlled intervals." The attending looked at her for a moment. Then, with the specific pragmatism of someone who recognized useful information and decided not to let ego get in the way of it, he nodded. She pulled a stool to the side of the bay and sat at Yara's level, close enough to see her pupils, both reactive, tracking together, which was what mattered most in this specific moment. "The text," Nora said, keeping her voice low. "Someone texted me tonight. What happened to Moss, past tense, before it happened?" Yara's eyes sharpened slightly through the concussive blur. "Prepositioned." "Yes. Which means the vehicle hit wasn't reactive to today's events. It was planned. Which means someone knew you were going to be in that transport before the transport was arranged." Yara's expression moved through something that was not quite fear and not quite anger, but occupied the space where those two things overlap. Inside the federal structure. "Or close enough to see it." Nora paused. "Cassidy needs to know." "Cassidy doesn't know I'm here yet," Yara said. The slur was slightly less pronounced than 30 seconds ago. She was tracking and compensating, which was her, which was exactly what Nora would have expected. "I'll reach her." Nora stood. "The imaging is going to take 20 minutes. I'm going to make calls. I'll be outside the curtain." "Voss?" Yara's voice stopped her. She turned. Yara looked at her from the hospital bed with the particular expression of someone who does not have the cognitive bandwidth for anything other than what is essential. "The case, is it solid, even with this?" "It's solid," Nora said. "It's in federal evidence, it's in Whitmore's hands, and it's on record. What happened tonight doesn't touch what Cassidy filed." Yara held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then she exhaled, and it was the exhale of someone releasing weight they have been carrying for 8 months, through the specific act of knowing that someone else is now carrying part of it, and that the part they're carrying is competent. "Okay," she said. Nora went outside the curtain and called Cassidy on every number she had, until one of them answered. Cassidy arrived at Denton Falls General 40 minutes later, with 2 additional agents and an expression that was doing a great deal of controlled work. She listened to Nora's account of the text message, standing in the waiting area with her arms crossed and her eyes steady. And when Nora finished, she said only, "Show me the phone." And Nora showed her, and Cassidy photographed the text and sent the number to her team before she had put her own phone back in her pocket. "The number traces to a prepaid," Cassidy said, "but the timing and the phrasing tell us things the number doesn't have to." She looked at Nora directly. "You said what happened to Moss, past tense, you're sure?" "I read it twice," Nora said. "Past tense. That's not someone reacting to today. That's someone operating on a parallel timeline." Cassidy paused. "Price?" The name sat in the air. "Wentworth handles the money," Cassidy said, talking it out. Not to Nora specifically, just through the logic. Price handles operations. The vehicle hit is operational. It's a message and a disruption simultaneously, which means he moved assets after the federal hold was filed, which means he had assets positioned before the hold, which means he was operating on the assumption that the submission was coming. "He was watching Yara long before tonight," Nora said. "Longer than I tracked," Cassidy said. It cost her something to say it. Not much, but Nora could see the increment of it. What changes? Nora said. The charge structure gets worse for him. Obstruction in addition to the fraud. If the driver of that pickup is identified and connected to Price, we add attempted federal witness interference. She paused. Which means the case gets stronger, not weaker. He accelerated his own outcome. That was the thing about men like Price, Nora thought. They operated from positions of power long enough that they stopped accurately modeling the consequences of their own actions. They moved assets and applied pressure because they always had, and because it had always worked, and because they had never been in a situation where the person on the other side of the pressure was someone who had built their entire professional existence around functioning correctly under exactly this kind of load. I need your formal statement about the text, Cassidy said. Tonight, if you can. I can, Nora said. She stayed at Denton Falls General until Yara's imaging came back. The CT showed a concussion with no intracranial bleeding, which was the outcome that mattered. The attending recommended a 24-hour observation hold, which was correct. Yara would be monitored, would recover, and would be available to provide testimony in a timeline that now had federal protection around it. Nora gave her formal statement to Cassidy's team in a family consultation room at 1:15 a.m. She signed it at 1:47. She drove home. She slept. The next 4 weeks were institutional in their texture. The specific grinding rhythm of a legal process that moves on its own timeline regardless of the urgency of the people inside it. Colonel Price was taken into federal custody 11 days after Yara's hospitalization. The driver of the pickup truck was identified through traffic camera footage from a camera 2 blocks from the intersection, connected to Price through a contractor relationship that had been buried under 2 layers of corporate structure and took Cassidy's team 6 days to excavate. The connection established the attempted witness interference charge and moved Price from a complex fraud case into a case with a dimension that federal prosecutors described to Nora when she asked, as extremely clarifying for their purposes. Wentworth surrendered voluntarily 3 days after Price's arrest, through his attorney, with the particular energy of a man who has looked at the available evidence and decided that cooperation was the only position with any future in it. His attorney's statement used the phrase fully intends to assist approximately 4 times, which told Nora everything she needed to know about the calculation being made. Vickers' situation resolved itself in a way that was less dramatic and more thorough. The internal affairs investigation that had been opened on the basis of Cassidy's referral expanded once investigators began pulling records, to include 6 months of conduct that had been formally complained about and informally buried by supervisors who had found him useful. 3 former Iron Crest students, Marcus was one of them, provided written statements about specific incidents of coercive behavior and inappropriate use of physical authority during training sessions. A woman named Diane, the one who had been looking at the floor during the sparring incident on Nora's first night, gave a recorded statement that was, from what Cassidy told her, detailed and specific, and not the first time she had tried to report it. His badge was suspended pending the investigation. The suspension was not temporary in any practical sense that anyone familiar with the evidence believed. Iron Crest was under new management within 2 weeks. Carver, the Blue Belt, sent Nora a text. "Different place already. Thought you should know for real this time." She texted back, "Good. Briggs's protocol complaint against her had been sitting in the hospital administration file through all of it, undisturbed by the events outside the building because institutional processes and the rest of life operate on entirely separate rhythms. It reached formal review at the 3-week mark, which meant a committee of 3, the nursing director, the chief of staff, and a patient safety officer, reviewed the documentation of the ketamine decision and the outcome and the subsequent cardiac notation in the patient's chart. The review took 40 minutes. Nora was not present for it. She was on the floor managing an acute asthma case in Bay 3. And she found out the result from Sandra Delaney, who came to find her at the medication cart with the expression of someone delivering news they have been looking forward to delivering for a period of time. "Cleared," Sandra said, "completely. The committee noted that the ketamine administration represented appropriate clinical judgment under emergency conditions with delayed physician availability, and they're recommending a protocol amendment that formally authorizes senior trauma nurses to administer specified agents under those conditions." Nora looked at her. "Dr. Rowe drafted the recommendation language," Sandra added. He submitted it to the committee before they met. Nora returned to the asthma case. She finished the shift. She did not say anything to Briggs. She didn't need to. The chart was the record. The record stood. He passed her in the corridor at 5:50, an hour before end of shift, and something in his expression had shifted in a way that was not apology and not quite acknowledgement, but was the particular look of a man who has collided with a consequence that came from a direction he did not anticipate and is in the process of adjusting his map accordingly. She nodded at him as she passed. He nodded back. That was all. Yara was discharged from Denton Falls General after 26 hours. She stayed in the city for the next 3 weeks, in a federal safe house rather than the Sunrise Inn, while the initial phases of the case processed and her testimony was formally recorded by federal prosecutors. She and Nora met for dinner on a Thursday at the Filipino restaurant on Maplecroft Street. They sat at a corner table and ate without performing anything for each other. No summary of what had happened, no retrospective analysis. Just two people who had been through something sitting in a good-smelling room and eating rice and taking the evening for what it was. "You're staying," Yara said. It was not a question. "I'm staying," Nora said. "In the nursing." "Yes." Yara moved food around her plate for a moment. "Farrell asked about you." "I know. He called." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'm a nurse," Nora said. Yara looked at her. "Is that enough for you?" Nora thought about it honestly, the way she had been trying to do things. Honestly, without the defensive overlay she had spent 4 years constructing around the question of who she was before and who she was now, and whether those two things could coexist without one of them consuming the other. "It's enough," she said, "but I think I've been doing it with one hand behind my back. Because of the other part. Because I convinced myself that the other part needed to be hidden. That being a nurse who had done what I'd done meant one of them was wrong." She paused. "It doesn't. It just means I'm the same person in different rooms." Yara looked at her with the flat, assessing look that was her default and that Nora had come to read over the years and the distance and the reconnection of this specific month as a form of respect, the look of someone who takes what they're hearing seriously enough not to perform a reaction. "You're better at this than you think," Yara said. "At what?" "Being both things at once." She went back to her food. "Most people can't." They ate. The restaurant was full around them. Someone's kid at the next table was negotiating loudly about something, and losing. And the losing had the particular quality of someone who would win eventually, but not tonight. And the whole scene had the texture of ordinary life going on around two people who had just come through something that was not ordinary and were finding their way back to ordinary with the specific gratitude of people who understand that ordinary is actually what you're fighting for. The Denton Falls Examiner ran the story on a Saturday, 6 weeks after the night at the Sunrise Inn. It was a full investigation piece. Kay Whitmore had done what Nora expected of someone who had been building on this beat for 18 months, which was to construct the complete picture rather than the dramatic summary. The procurement fraud at Linden Base, the shell company structures, Price and Wentworth named with specific documentation. The parallel local dimension, Vickers, his role as a facilitator, the badge, and the gym, and the way institutional trust had been used as a tool for something that was its opposite. Nora's name was in the story. Not prominently, she was described as a local nurse and former military medical professional whose intervention had been critical to preserving the evidence chain and protecting the federal witness, and the description was accurate and spare, and she appreciated both qualities. She read it at her kitchen table on Saturday morning, with coffee that she had made herself rather than the hospital vending machine variety. And she read it once through, and then she set it down and looked out the window at the parking lot. The phone rang. It was her mother calling from 3 states away, who read the paper online and had very specific feelings about the information it contained, specifically the part where her daughter had apparently been in a parking lot fight at 2:30 in the morning and had not mentioned this at any point during their weekly calls. The conversation took 45 minutes and was not comfortable, and Nora answered every question honestly, rather than managing it, which was harder and more correct. And by the end of it, her mother was not entirely appeased, but had moved from alarm to the particular form of resigned pride that mothers develop when their children are definitively, demonstrably themselves, in ways that cause stress, and are also inarguably correct. "You could have been hurt," her mother said. "I was," Nora said. "My shoulder was bruised for 2 weeks. That's not funny. I know. I'm okay, Mom. A pause. Are you? Nora looked at the kitchen window, the parking lot, the ordinary Saturday morning of a city that had no idea she existed, which was fine, which was exactly how she had wanted it for 4 years. Yeah, she said. I am. She went back to Ironcrest the following Tuesday. The mat was the same. The heavy bags were the same. The photographs that had lined the wall were different. Vickers' competition wins had been replaced by a display of the gym's full student roster, organized by progression, which was a change in both decor and philosophy. The instructor was a woman named Pratt, mid-30s, who had a jiu-jitsu instructor certification and a secondary background in conflict de-escalation that she had apparently spent the last 2 years integrating into her teaching methodology. She ran the warm-up with the brisk, organized energy of someone who was comfortable in the front of the room without requiring the room to perform its comfort back at her. Marcus was there. His shoulder was fully recovered. He had been coming twice a week since the new instructor started, which she could tell from the way he moved. There was something more settled in it, less of the protective tentativeness that had been there before. Petra was there. She had brought a friend. Carver was there, running the intermediate group in the back half of the mat. He acknowledged Nora with a nod when she came in, the same small nod from weeks ago, the one she had been correct to accept. Nora changed, warmed up, and took her place on the mat. Pratt ran the class through a defense sequence, a standing clinch break followed by a transition, and the instruction was clear and technically grounded, and notably, when a student asked a question about why the mechanics worked the way they did, she answered it completely, including the biomechanical basis, without making the asking of the question into a power negotiation. Small things. Again, the structure was made of them. During partnered drilling, Petra worked with Nora. You came back, Petra said. I paid for a month, Nora said. Petra smiled. It was a real smile, not the careful one from before. I read the thing in the paper. I figured. You didn't say anything when I asked where you learned. I said different places, Nora said. That's still accurate. Military different places. Among others. She adjusted Petra's elbow angle, not correcting aggressively, just a light repositioning that changed the mechanical result immediately and demonstrably. There, feel the difference? Petra ran the technique. Yes. Yeah. That's why the angle matters, Nora said. Same answer as before. Petra looked at her for a moment with the direct, considering look of someone who has more questions than she's asking. Nora didn't fill the space. Will you teach? Petra asked. I'm not an instructor, Nora said. You could be. Nora thought about it. She ran the technique they were drilling, her own version, at her own speed, feeling the mechanics settle into the muscle memory that had been there for years before she'd asked it to rest. The movement was clean. It had always been clean. She had just stopped using it in visible rooms. Maybe, she said. It was the most honest answer she had, and honest answers were what she was working toward. The formal outcome of the federal case was announced 11 weeks after Cassidy's initial submission in a press release from the Inspector General's office that ran 3 paragraphs in the national news and considerably more than 3 paragraphs in the Denton Falls Examiner, which had been following it closely. Colonel Price, charged with procurement fraud, misuse of federal funds, and attempted interference with a federal witness. The attempted interference charge, built on the connection between Price and the pickup truck driver, carried additional weight that the prosecutors had used to their advantage in structuring the full charge package. Wentworth, charged with procurement fraud and conspiracy. His cooperation was noted in the language but did not translate into anything that meaningfully reduced what he was facing. The scale of the fraud was substantial enough that cooperation bought him a better process, not a better outcome. The amount recovered or identified for recovery across the 22-month fraud period was cited in the press release as substantial, which was the specific language that Federal Communications used when the actual number was large enough to require context before it landed correctly. Vickers' internal affairs investigation concluded the same week. His badge was permanently revoked. The Denton Falls PD released a statement that used the word misconduct twice and the phrase abuse of authority once, which was less than his actual conduct warranted and more than his conduct had previously produced in official documentation, which meant it was progress of the imperfect and real variety. 3 separate former students, Marcus included, had civil claims in process. Nora was not a party to those claims. She had given her statement to the investigators, and her statement was in the record, and that was her contribution to that particular outcome. She did not celebrate any of it. Not because she wasn't relieved, she was, but because celebration felt like the wrong shape for the thing she was feeling, which was less triumphant than exhausted, and less exhausted than clarified. Like something that had been out of alignment for a long time had finally been put back in the correct position, and the sensation was not dramatic, just correct. The last time she saw Yara was at Cassidy's field office on Renner Street for a final case debrief that was administratively necessary and humanly awkward in the way that final meetings always are, when the shared purpose that has been holding a configuration of people together is officially complete and everyone is about to return to the separate lives the purpose temporarily reorganized. They stood in the parking lot afterward. It was cold. The sky was the flat gray of a Denton Falls autumn that had made up its mind. "Where are you going?" Nora said. "DC for the next phase of testimony," Yara said. "After that, I don't know. Farrell has something he wants to discuss." "Are you going back in?" Yara looked at the sky for a moment. "I don't know," she said. She said it without the operational flatness, just as a fact. "Probably some version of it. Not the same version." She paused. "You?" "No," Nora said. Not hesitation, just honesty. "No, but I'm not hiding from what I was anymore, which is different from going back." Yara looked at her. "You know the thing that got me through 8 months of that alone?" Nora waited. "Every time I almost stopped," Yara said, "I thought about the people at Linden who didn't know the money meant for their medical supplies was going somewhere else, that it mattered to specific people who never knew their name was in the equation." She paused. "That's why you're a nurse, Voss. Not instead of the other thing, because of it." Nora held that for a moment. It was the kind of thing that, when someone said it correctly, you recognized as something you had known for a long time without having the words for it. "Get some actual sleep," Nora said. "In DC." "I'll try," Yara said. They didn't hug. That was not their configuration. But the parting had the weight of something real, the specific gravity of a connection that had been tested by circumstances that were not theoretical and had held. Yara got in the federal vehicle. Nora stood in the parking lot until it turned out of view. Then she got in her car and drove back to Caldwell Regional for a 4 to midnight shift. Bay 2 had a man in his 60s with chest pressure and a diaphoresis pattern that was worrying in the way that warranted immediate workup. She managed his initial stabilization while Dr. Rowe ran the ECG. And she watched the strip come out, and she saw what she saw, and she had the IV line established, and the medication drawn before Dr. Rowe had fully verbalized his assessment. He looked at her across the bay. "Good catch," he said. "The diaphoresis started 2 hours ago," she said. "He waited because he thought it was indigestion." "They always think it's indigestion," Rowe said. He was already on the phone with cardiology. She finished the protocol. She documented. She moved to the next bay. This was the work. The specific, unglamorous, consequential work of being present for people on the worst days of their lives, in the moments when their body had stopped cooperating with the life they were trying to live, and providing the bridge between the failure and the recovery with knowledge and steadiness, and the particular kind of attention that could not be faked. She had done it in uniforms before this one. She had done it in places and situations that she would not be describing to anyone in this building, not because they were shameful, but because they belonged to a version of herself that she had been trying to put in a box. And the box, it turned out, was not the right container. You did not put the things that made you who you were in a box. You carried them differently, depending on the room, depending on what was needed. But you didn't put them away. She understood that now in a way she had not when she arrived in Denton Falls 4 years ago with her nursing license and her packed apartment and her determination to be only one thing. She had always been one thing. She had just been describing it wrong. She was a person who showed up for other people when the situation was bad, and the stakes were real, and most people in the room were not sure what to do. She did that in trauma bays. She had done it in other places. She would go on doing it in whatever rooms the next years put her in, because that was not a choice she had made. It was a fact about herself that she had finally stopped trying to qualify. Sandra Delaney caught up with her at the nurses' station at 9:30 between cases, with the specific energy of someone who has been meaning to say something and has finally located the right moment. I wanted to ask, Sandra said, the thing you asked me to do, with my keycard. You slowed down a reader that was malfunctioning, Nora said. Right. Sandra paused. I looked up what you did, what the case was about. Nora looked at her. I'm not asking for details, Sandra said. I just wanted you to know that I'd do it again, the slowing down thing. She paused. And anything else, if it came to it. Nora looked at her for a moment. 26 years old, 2 years out of school, still learning where the lines were and how to stand on the right side of them when it mattered. Still developing the particular courage that was not dramatic, not decorated, just the quiet willingness to put your keycard between something wrong and someone who needed the time. Thank you, Nora said. She meant it the way it was given, without excess, without performance, just directly. Sandra nodded and went back to her charts. The night continued. At 11:40, the chest pressure patient in Bay 2 was stable and had been formally admitted to the cardiac floor. At 11:50, a laceration case came in from a kitchen accident that was messy and ultimately straightforward. At 12:10, Nora signed out, changed, and walked through the hospital's main corridor toward the employee exit. She passed the community board on the way out. The Iron Crest flyer was still there. The original one, she thought, or one like it, the paper slightly curled at the corner from weeks on the corkboard. She looked at it for a moment, then she kept walking. Outside, the parking lot was cold and mostly empty, the overhead lights doing their steady, indifferent work over the rows of cars belonging to the people who were inside managing someone else's emergency. She found her car, put her bag in the passenger seat, and sat for a moment with the heater running low. She thought about Yara somewhere on a plane to D.C. She thought about Marcus with his recovered shoulder and his civil claim. She thought about Petra, who asked good questions and had stopped apologizing for asking them. She thought about Carver's nod and Sandra's keycard, and Dr. Rowe, who had drafted a protocol amendment because something should exist where there had been a gap. She thought about Vickers, not with satisfaction and not with pity, but with the specific clear-eyed acknowledgement that the thing about people who build their authority on the assumption that no one around them is capable of pushing back is that the assumption is always eventually wrong. The only question is how long before the right person walks in the door. She had walked in the door. She had not done it heroically. She had done it because she had enrolled in a gym and a student's shoulder was at the wrong angle, and she had said so. She had done it because Yara had needed someone for 24 hours who understood the weight of what she was carrying. She had done it because the work in front of her, the next chart, the next patient, the next shift, had always been the thing that connected the two versions of herself she'd been trying to keep separate. They were not separate. They had never been. She was a nurse who had survived things that most nurses hadn't, and who had built from those things a set of capabilities that she had been treating as a liability, and that were, in the accounting she was finally willing to do honestly, the reason she was good at what she was good at. The quiet ones. The steady ones. The ones who don't announce themselves when they walk into a room. Those are not the people you overlook safely. Those are the people who are already seeing everything before you looked up. She put the car in drive and pulled out of the lot, and the city opened up around her the way cities do at midnight. Quiet in the surface, alive underneath, full of people who were asleep or working or afraid or recovering, all of them unknown to each other, all of them carrying the full weight of whoever they were. She drove home through the cold and the empty streets of Denton Falls, and the life she had built here held around her like something that was not perfect and not finished but was entirely,